I think it is clear to believe in the power of ideas.
Fresh thinking to the Manhattan Institute.
Thank you. This is the good news of the day, which I'm going to argue we have the capacity to keep going. To understand how New York's annual homicide toll reached the bloody peak of 2,262 in 1990, listen to the ideas about crime and law enforcement embraced by many of New York's politicians and opinion leaders over the last 4 decades. Here's CUNY sociologist Andrew Hacker in 1975. A recent upsurge in crime, he said, quote, expresses a new sense of freedom on the part of classes which were once kept sternly in their place, end quote. Policing is nothing more than, quote, picking on the poor, according to Hacker. Mayor John Lindsay rejected calls for a stronger police response to the rising crime of the 1960s, seeing little difference between what he called the, quote, random terror of the criminal and the official terror of the state. Peace cannot be imposed on our cities by force of arms, he said in 1968, nor can people be converted at the point of a gun. And just last May, John Jay criminologist Andrew Carmen announced at a conference on black crime that policing was a, quote, repressive reaction, which only makes crime worse, end quote. Crime, in other words, according to this still powerful ideology, is an understandable reaction to inequality and racism, and policing, at best an ineffective and at worst an inflammatory reaction to it. Violence and theft, the thinking goes, can only be reduced by eliminating their root causes with government social programs and redistribution of wealth. Now, remarkably, many police chiefs in New York and elsewhere accepted this declaration of their own irrelevance. Since law enforcement couldn't lower crime, they conveniently concluded, they would focus on keeping their officers away from anything that could lead to racial conflict or corruption, away, that is, from anything resembling real policing. By 1990, when homicides reached their historic high, this double excuse for both crime and police ineffectiveness had nearly brought New York City to its knees. Youth packs rampaged through parks and subways. Graffiti, aggressive panhandlers, and squeegee men defined the street culture in many parts of the city. And car owners posted pathetic little pleas to vandals not to break into their cars. The national media declared New York a disaster zone. After 4 children were gunned down in 9 days in 1990, Time magazine reported that New Yorkers were sinking to, quote, a new depth of despair. The fatal stabbing that same year of a young tourist from Utah by a group of teen subway thugs who were attacking his parents symbolized to a shocked country everything that had gone wrong with New York. But just 6 years later, homicides were down 56%, and the city's image radically transformed. The Big Apple comes roaring back, declared U.S. News and World Report. New York shows that winning the war against crime is possible, proclaimed Time magazine. In 1998, a new cable TV show portrayed New York City as a glittering mecca for beautiful, libidinous women who managed to find time for exciting careers within their complicated bedroom itineraries. Tourism in New York City rose 39% from 1991 to 97 on the city's new reputation for safety. High school students clamored to get into the city's universities, And cutting-edge restaurants opened in once forlorn drug outposts of Manhattan and Brooklyn, bringing more development in their wake. What had happened? Nothing less than the demolition of New York's reigning ideology about crime and law enforcement. The most startling thing that William Bratton did upon taking control of the New York Police Department in '94 was to announce that he would lower crime in his first year by 10%. No police chief in living memory had ever publicly announced a numerical crime target. This signaled Bratton's total break with the complacency that gave both criminals and the police a free pass. Bratton not only met his target, he bested it, bringing in a 12% reduction in '94, while crime in the rest of the country dropped 1%. The next year, he upped the ante, promising a 15% reduction and delivering 16%, while crime in the rest of the country stayed flat. Bratton accomplished this unprecedented feat with the managerial revolution that came to be known as CompStat. The department started obsessively gathering and analyzing crime data on a daily basis. Precinct commanders were held ruthlessly accountable for the safety of their precincts. Top brass grilled them on their crime stats in weekly meetings, reinforcing the message that the police would and could lower crime. Crime went into free fall and has not stopped dropping since. Job growth revved up in 1997 and continued through 2008, stalling only for the dot-com bust of 2000 and the 9/11 terror attacks. Real estate values took off in 1998, rising most where crime fell the farthest. New York's population grew 15% in the 1990s, a rise unmatched by any other large industrial city. And tourists have continued to pour over the last decade, spending nearly $29 billion and generating $17 billion in wages in 2007 alone. This graph shows the inverse relation between the city's crime rate and the number of tourists that come to the city. Nowhere was the benefit of reduced crime more striking than in the city's poorest neighborhoods, which saw some of the largest rises in real estate values. Vacant lots that had lain fallow for decades, serving as a breeding ground for lawlessness, were snapped up and developed. National chains that had shunned areas for decades suddenly set up stores. Newly minted homeowners helped keep the peace, and over 10,000 minority males were spared the bullet that would have taken their lives had homicide rates remained at their early 1990s levels. The moral is clear. No government program yet devised has had a more positive impact on New York City's economy than effective policing. Fear is inimical to the vibrant street culture that is the lifeblood of cities. A decade and a half of accountable policing has done more to revive New York's natural dynamism and help the city's poor than the hundreds of billions of dollars of welfare spending that liberal ideology told us was the key to New York's revival. So how has the recession affected New York City's crime route? So far, not perceptibly, thanks to astounding management. Defying the predictions of the press and the criminology profession, crime continues to drop, reaching an astounding 77% decline since 1990. But budget cuts seriously threaten Commissioner Ray Kelly's ability to keep delivering on the CompStat principles. Manpower alone does not guarantee policing success, but it is a vital precondition to that success when combined with vigorous crime analysis. Over the course of the 1990s, the NYPD added 7,000 officers to reach a peak force size of 40,000 in the year 2000. Since then, however, the department has cut 5,000 officers and continues to shrink. Mayor Bloomberg has just canceled a new class of rookies that were due to be sworn in tomorrow, jeopardizing Commissioner Kelly's innovative strategy for overcoming the department's dwindling numbers. Rather than distributing new graduates proportionally across the 76 precincts, Commissioner Kelly masses them in the city's highest crime areas, where they walk footbeats. Crime in these so-called impact zones has dropped at twice the rate this year compared to the overall city average, demonstrating that highly visible police presence combined with law enforcement and ticket writing does deter crime. Now, I'm not going to pretend that New York City has been reduced, that the police force has been reduced to some wan, consumptive invalid. Even after the force reductions, the New York City Police Department remains on a per capita basis larger than nearly every other department in the country. But New York's policing challenges are also outsized, and they're only going to grow, especially after the repeal this year of the Rockefeller drug laws starts putting drug dealers back on the streets for alleged drug treatment. The force size reductions must be reduced. Mayor Bloomberg is playing with fire. The police department is not just one city agency among equals, it is the cornerstone on which the city's economic viability depends. If crime starts going up and stays up, New York can kiss its hopes for an economic recovery goodbye. Over the long run, money for increased manpower should come from within the police budget itself. Preposterously cushy police pensions exemplify the unsustainable government retirement system that EJ so chillingly described. To fund the New York Police Department's pension obligations, the city is now required to set aside 50% of the average cop's salary additionally for every working officer, raising the cost of running the department by 50%. If that contribution was cut to just 25% of a working officer's salary, the force could add 3,500 extra officers at no cost. In the short term, however, until politicians summon the will to tackle pension reform, and we better hope they do, resources for beefing up the NYPD can be found by turning city government towards the core functions of government and away from useless social uplift projects. I'll give you just one example of a counterproductive welfare program that deserves the axe. The city spends a whopping $443 million a year providing free apartments to young single mothers who claim homelessness, which usually means that they no longer want to live doubled up with their own single mother. This no-strings-attached subsidy entitles them to continue the destructive inner-city culture of fatherless families. If the subsidy for homeless family housing could be cut to a still huge $200 million a year, the city could fund an additional 2,000 police recruits. For years now, the FBI has ranked New York as the safest big city in the country. This highly publicized designation is an economic marketing tool of immeasurable worth and must not be allowed to be taken from us. There's still plenty of New Yorkers, unfortunately, who still regard policing as the, quote, official terror of the state. And they are gleefully predicting that New York's crime rate will yet rise during the recession. The NYPD is fully prepared to prove them wrong, so long as it has the resources to do so. If the city keeps its crime route on course during this time of straitened circumstances, it will emerge from the recession with an unbeatable claim to prominence as the most creative and safest city in the world. Thank you very much. Michael.
I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry. I realized this is Brian's role. Sorry. Wait, Michael, we'll get to you. I promise you. Okay.
So this gentleman up here, keep on. Just wait for the microphone.
Following Saul's lecture about the teachers' union contract, I was curious to know, when Bratton came in, we have obviously a police union. How did he manage to overcome what could have been some really nasty battles with the police union in carrying out his policies? Could you give us some insight in the labor negotiations that may or may not have gone on when Bratton was instituting CompStat?
Well, you know, it's odd. I hate to say this, but often I talk to police officers, the ones absolutely on the streets, and they don't have a clear vision of CompStat. What Bratton really did was shake up the command staff. That's where the transformation occurred. I don't think he really, he did press detectives to start working at night when crime mostly occurs rather than having an 8 to 5 job. But he worked his magic by really putting the fear of God in the hearts of precinct commanders. And they're not covered by the same union contracts. The pension reform, I'm not aware that he took that on at all. But he had an extraordinary talent for spotting the hard charges within the department, and people that were not succeeding during the CompStat meetings were told basically that their career was over. And he elevated people like Lou Anemone and the late Jack Maple and John Timoney, who were just visionaries about how police could be used to reduce crime. And it was at that level that things really were shaken up. But to this day, I think that this is the remaining undone business in CompStat, which is to drive the numbers obsession that currently haunts police commanders down to the officer level. They still sort of, it's funny, they love Bratton for a while, but officers tend to be so cynical about their jobs that after a while they hate every commissioner they've got, I'm afraid. So Bratton, in one sense, was fortunate by having a short time there. Whether if he'd stayed beyond 2 years, maybe he too would have had the same bitterness towards him.
Michael?
Sounds like, to answer the previous question, it sounds like you need a CompStat for the public schools.
Right.
No excuses.
And some places are doing that.
Right. My question is about the Giuliani approach, which was the Bratton approach. Giuliani said, with respect to those who are arguing that you can't crack down on crime in the black ghettos, Giuliani said it is a matter of equal protection of the law, that minority people deserved and had a right to be safe and secure in their homes and in their property and in their lives. And so he said no excuses, and therefore he argued it was equal protection of the law. You introduced your subject with the phrase black crime, which raises
This was a conference, I'm sorry, that's what the conference was on.
Right.
It's not my,
Well, my question.
at John Jay.
I understand, but my question relates to the question of accountability for the police, because the response to the high number of blacks who have been stopped and frisked, for example, who have not been guilty of any offense and were found not to have been involved in any kind of crime. The response to that was, well, blacks commit most crimes, and therefore the charge comes from the constitutionalists that there is a racial profile, unconstitutional racial profiling that's going on. My question to you is, if Giuliani was correct, no more excuses, there is no such thing as black crime, a punk is a punk. Why do the police officials and others who defend stops and frisks use race as a matter of arguing that blacks commit crimes, and therefore there should be no concerns about how number of blacks who are stopped and frisked, when the evidence suggests that there is no accountability on police officers who misbehave.
Well, Michael, it's not the police who are using crime, it's the New York Civil Liberties Union. They're the ones that annually get together a bunch of police data and distribute police stops and frisks and arrests on the basis of racial categories. That's not how the police operate. As far as whether the police, what they look for is behavior that raises their suspicion, neighborhoods that are known drug areas and crime areas, citizen complaints. I have been to many police precinct community meetings in Harlem and Brooklyn and the Bronx, where the first thing you hear from the neighbors that come to those precincts is, we want more cops, and we want the dealers off the streets for good. We don't want them back the next day. The police, when they're making an arrest on a drug corner, most of the time it's because the community is asking them to do so. Now, as for the charge that stop and frisks are racially disproportionate, and again, it's the New York Civil Liberties Union that is seeing things through the lens of race. If you go to a CompStat meeting, you're not going to see race mentioned. You're going to see crime statistics that are organized on the basis of neighborhoods, because, as you say, giving Giuliani credit, he understood that the right to be free from fear from crime is a civil right. So it's the Civil Liberties Union that's making this a racial issue, not the police. But let's look at the crime statistics. Blacks commit 82% of all shootings in New York City. They're 24% of the city population. When you add Hispanic shootings to that total, you get 98%. Whites and Asians combined are committing less than 1% of shootings in New York City. This means that when the police are trying to get guns off the streets, when they've got victim IDs, and that's what they work with, it's not the police that are coming up with some profile for who they think a criminal is. It's the victims of criminals, who are usually minorities themselves, who are saying, I just got mugged by a Hispanic guy. There is no way that the police can go after crime in the neighborhoods where it's happening and not come up with racially disproportionate numbers, given the disproportion in the crime rates. Now, in fact, blacks are stopped at a rate underneath what you would expect, given the crime rates. Blacks are 55% of all stops in New York City. They're 24% of the population. According to the victims of and witnesses to violent crimes, they commit 67% of all violent crimes. Whites are overstopped. As far as stopping people that are found to have no evidence on them, the exact same rate occurs between black stops and white stops. So there's no evidence within the NYPD that blacks are being stopped at a higher rate than whites are. Why may somebody be stopped without coming up with evidence? There is no question that many times the cop has simply judged the situation incorrectly. I'm afraid the officers are not able to make sure that the only people they ever stop are ones that have guns on them. But the police, one of the most frequent reasons for making a stop, and you can see these data yourself from the NYPD, is somebody appears to be casing a target, either a person or a location, and the police make a stop. That could be, in fact, disrupting criminal activity without producing grounds for arrest. The police tend to know who the criminals are. They make proactive stops. There's no question. They're basically sending a message to gang members, we know who you guys are. So if they have any ground for stop, they're going to use it. So I am glad, Michael, that you do agree that safety is a civil right, and I think the NYPD has done the most extraordinary job in the country of guaranteeing that to all New Yorkers.
This gentleman right here in the middle, and just wait for the microphone, please. John, can you get that, please?
Ed Cox.
Hi.
Heather, what is your view? You expressed that cops know who the criminals are. What was the role of community policing, that change in policy, which I think started on the Dinkins administration? What impact did that have on the cops knowing better in each community what was going on? That is, getting the policy being getting them out of being in the more centralized and going out to places where crime was in their squad cars and getting them on the beat.
Well, the idea of community policing that preceded Mayor Giuliani and William Bratton was a little bit different than that. It was the idea that the cops on the beat would be the problem solver. And if there was a vacant lot, say, the cop would call up the city sanitation department and say, there's some trash here, can you pick it up? And they would try and mediate between the different groups and perhaps, work out truces. And it was a more conventional idea of community policing. What Bratton saw was that this idea of community policing as problem solving may be appropriate for Ann Arbor, Michigan, where one of the theorists of this had done work, or Irvine, California, where my mother lives, which is very low crime. But when you have homicides over 2,000 a year, you can't have the cops out there worried about cleaning up a vacant lot. You have to have them doing the traditional role of policing, which is to get violent criminals off the streets. And so Bratton said, we're putting our accountability on the precinct commanders. The cops are his shock troops, but it's the precinct commanders that we're focusing on. So you could still call it community policing, and the fact is that there's no agreed upon definition of community policing. But this wasn't a question of getting cops out of their squad cars. It really was a question of changing the attitude that the managers in the department had about crime. They really did believe that they couldn't do anything about it. And so the whole thing was to keep drug informants and drug cops away from any situation that could lead to corruption, because there had been a periodic history of awful corruption, and they didn't want riots exploding on their hands. So it was about becoming aggressive, and of course, as the Manhattan Institute can rightly take credit for, an understanding as well about the theory of broken windows policing, that you do not walk by and not ticket somebody for graffiti or for turnstile dropping, because there's a great chain of being in the criminal universe, and somebody who is jumping a turnstile is likely to also be ripping off people at night. So there were changes in tactics, but it really wasn't about community policing as it's usually understood. It was about infusing a fanatical sense of urgency on a daily basis about fighting crime.
Time for one quick last question, Chuck.
Hi, may be unanswerable, but Bloomberg added 41,000 employees in the 2 terms and cut 5,000 cops. Question is, why did Curtis Sliwa at his 30th anniversary at Manhattan Institute recently allow Bloomberg to get up and talk about how successful he was in stopping crime?
Well, I guess you should ask Ray Kelly that. I guess Kelly's a good soldier. The fact is, he has cut crime. I mean, that's the amazing thing. And this CompStat, well, look at Giuliani got rid of Bratton. Let's face it, mayors have somewhat of a tendency to take credit for crime drops, don't they? And that's why the mayor of New York City, Antonio Villaraigosa, he's not done a thing in the city, but he has given Bratton more cops. And Bratton is doing the exact same thing in LA with a force a third the size of New York's, as he did in New York, proving that CompStat is a system of just extraordinary beauty that New York should, we should be telling the world about this. So Bloomberg takes credit, that's fine, as long as he doesn't fire his police commissioner. I'll give him that little white lie.
All right, thank you very much, Ed.
I think it is clear how fortunate we are to believe in the power of ideas.
Supply the common sense and the fresh thinking of the Manhattan Institute.